This week we're starting a brand new series called All the Things. All the things you don't have to do for God to be good with you. If you were here with us last week, we were in a series called Great Things. The next series is going to be called Regular Things. Just kidding. All the things. We actually didn't do that on purpose. All the things. But before we jump into all the things, I want to tell you a little story, and hopefully this will set things up for you a little bit. So when I was in, maybe about fourth grade, I had this friend. His name was Joe, and I'd like to go to his house after school. We tried to arrange little play dates where we play video games or whatever, but I don't know if it's still like this, but at the time, what you could do is send in a little note from your parent, and it would say, please allow Lou to go on Joe's bus today after school. You know that, right? Can we still do that? Pretty cool. It's like a little school-sponsored Uber, right, to your parents' house, your friend's house, rather. So that was the plan. So I'm getting on Joe's bus. And now this was a different bus. For me, it was a whole new world. And I get on the bus, and right away, I walk to the very back of the bus, where nothing good ever happens, right? But I walk to the back of the bus. I see there's a lot of kids back there. The seats are pretty full, but then there's this one. It's wide open. I see that seat. I'm like, that's my seat. And I sit down in the seat, and right away, the person right across from me looks over and goes, don't sit there. And now I wanna, right? She's like, don't sit there. And then I hear other voices like, don't sit there. And eventually I asked, like, okay, well, why? Why can't I sit in the seat? And what I hear is that that's Ryan's seat. Ryan. Now, I don't know Ryan, so I don't know. I wasn't really persuaded, but what I heard was that it's Ryan's seat. He doesn't like when people sit there, and he's also a pretty big guy, so you might not want to sit there. You might want to listen to Ryan, right? And so eventually, Ryan got on the bus, and I'll spare you the details of the story. Eventually, he got a seat. But initially, I'm just told, right? I'm just told, don't sit there. No context, just don't, right? Because Ryan says so. And I got questions. I want to know why. What's the motive here? How do you typically respond when you're given instructions with no context, right? What do you do when you're told what to do? You know your personality. How does it typically sit with you? Like some people, some of us, maybe, we just comply. I don't want to rock the boat, right? I don't want to upset the apple cart. Or maybe you hear someone tell you what to do right away. You're like, no. Resist, unless you're forced to, unless someone's gonna make me, I'm not doing. Or maybe you've got questions, like me. I probably fall into that camp. Like, I'm not necessarily compliant or resistant. I just want to know who says and why. What's the motive here, right? I'm willing to bet that some of us were introduced to God the way that I was introduced to Ryan, right? Like, all of a sudden, one day, I don't know where you were, how old you were, but at some point, somebody said, don't do that, because God says so. And all of a sudden, God enters the picture of your story. You got to do that, and you can't do that because God says so. And God is introduced along with a world of to-dos and to-don'ts, right? All the God things you're supposed to do and you're not supposed to do. And you're introduced to him at that point with those instructions. And all he is this being, right? Like Ryan, like he's bigger than you. And so you should probably listen to him. And you probably responded in one of a few ways. Maybe you were compliant and you're like, well, might as well, right? Maybe you're here today because you're compliant. Just want to make God happy. Maybe you're resistant, and maybe you're here today because someone forced you or made you. Or maybe you grew up and you were forced to or made to comply, and now you're out of where you were and you're like, I'm done because no one's making me. Or maybe you had questions and maybe you were allowed to ask those questions. Or maybe you had questions and you weren't allowed to ask those questions because you don't want to doubt or be irreverent by questioning God with his list of to-dos and to-don'ts, with all the things. Some of us, a lot of us, I would suggest, were introduced to God really without much context. And over the course of the next couple weeks, what I want to do is kind of put all the things in context. Introduce you, maybe even reintroduce you to these ideas, these to-dos and these to-don'ts, these shoulds and shouldn'ts, the thou shalt nots in context. And put them where they belong. And so maybe for you, maybe you've been doing the church thing for years and years and you're totally comfortable. Maybe for you, like, maybe you set aside what you know and think about what it would look like to rebuild the framework of your faith. Or maybe church is not a thing for you. Maybe you're still kind of like testing the waters. And maybe this will help you understand where all those rules and restrictions and regulations and everything that religion has gotten a reputation for, where those things fit into place, in context, in the big picture. And maybe you'll see, if your story's anything like mine, that understanding where they go totally changes the story. And so to start with, we kind of have to look at how that framework, the original one, the common one, was formed. There's a guy, his name was Paul. We know him as the Apostle Paul. If you've been here, you've probably heard me talk about him before, or Saint Paul. He came after Jesus, and he did more for the church as a whole, probably than anyone else has done for the church, like all throughout history. He started all these churches in all these cities and really, really made an impact. What would happen is he'd start a church, and then he'd leave the church and he'd hear like the church has a problem. So he would write them letters and be like, here's the answer to your problem. And he'd send the letter off and try to help them fix it. But every once in a while, he'd write a letter to a church that he had never been to. Now, there was a church in Rome that he didn't start, but he cared a lot about this church, and he had dreams of one day going to Rome. If you were here with us last week, we actually talked about how he wanted to go to Rome. But he had never been there, and he wanted to explain like the whole idea of everything that he was teaching and what he wanted people to believe about Jesus. He wanted to explain it from start to finish, like really build an understanding of God and faith, because he'd never been there. They weren't familiar with his teaching. So he writes them a letter, and it's a long one, and it's pretty deep, and it's pretty complicated. You may know it as the book of Romans, but really it's just a letter that Paul wrote to a church in Rome. And the letter is broken up into two main parts. I know it's a little boring, but just kind of roll with me for a little bit, right? It's broken up into two main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, and then there's chapters 12 through 16. Now, 1 through 11 is really deep and spiritual and theological. He talks about these big, chunky concepts like justification and sanctification and glorification and all the other fications. And it's nice. It's like a lot of backstory, right? Then he gets to chapter 12 and he gets real practical. And he's like, okay, here's what you do and here's what you don't do. These are like all the things in chapter 12, all the to-dos and the to-don'ts. Now, I'll tell you something about me, all right? I'm a real practical guy, and I'm not super patient. So, when there's like backstory, I'm like, all right, like let's get to it, cut to the chase. Just tell me what to do. When I read a book, I don't read the introduction. We're just going to start right in chapter 1 or the foreword, the acknowledgments. I'm skipping right over that. And so I get to like this book of Romans, right? And what I do, just in the way I think, is like, okay, that's nice. And maybe one day when I'm interested in stuff like that, I'll get to it. But just tell me what I'm supposed to do. And so we get to the to-dos in chapter 12. And here's what Paul says in chapter 12. He says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters. He's talking to the people in Rome. He says, in view of God's mercy, there's another abstract theological principle, but he's getting to it. He says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. That's a big deal, right? Like a sacrifice in the ancient world was something you presented on an altar. He's like, present yourself, not dead, but alive. Like all of you, all of it. What you do, what you think, what you say, all of it, present it to God. That's a big to do. That is the ultimate to do. So he's like, go do that. And that's holy and pleasing to God. Here's another spiritual concept again, holy. This is your true and proper worship, another spiritual concept. And so that's the topic sentence. Like there it is. He's like, you want to know what to do? Everything. Do it all. And I don't know about you, but in most of my relationships, especially when there's an authority and or an instructor with instructions, and then there's a person being instructed, right? In situations like that, for things to be good, there's got to be a level of compliance. There's got to be a level of obedience. And so in my head, as I'm trying to figure this out, and maybe your process is similar to this. It's like, okay, there's all the to-dos and to-don'ts. God is the authority, and he's telling us like what the instructions are. If I want things to be good with him, I got to listen to what he says, right? I got to do what he says to do. And so he said, like Paul writes, like give yourself as a living sacrifice. And then he goes and he explains, like love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you and don't retaliate and don't be proud and be humble. And he gives like all the things you'd think. Right? And so I'm thinking like, okay, to be good with God, like I got to do those things because he's the authority. And so all those things in chapter 12, along with really by extension, all the things I'm taught to do and not to do in the church world, the thou shalt nots, like they become to me, they are all the things I have to do for God to be good with you. For you, all the things God, you have to do for God to be good with you. And that's the framework of Christianity that like developed in my head. It's the framework of religion that developed in my head. Like I got to do these things, I got to check these boxes or I'm not going to be okay with God. And emotionally, all the things, all the to-dos, they sit like the right thing to do. Like, okay, that's how we talk about them, right? I got to do the right thing. I know what I want to do, but let me try to do the right thing. Because if I want to be right with God, I got to do the right thing. And really what it is a performance-based form of religion. And this is how a lot of people understand religion and God. Like if you're doing good, well then God's good with you. He's like smiling. But if you're not, well, he's not happy with you. And the issue with this model of faith is that one, it's stressful. Two, you never really know where you stand with God. Like how well am I doing? Well, not as bad as them, but not as good as them. It's guilt driven. You feel guilty. It's fearful because what's going to happen to me if I don't? And it produces people, religious people who are judgmental. Why? Because if I'm going to put myself through all this in order to, like for me to be good with God, and you're not even going to try, if I've got to be miserable, you should have to as well. And if you're not going to try, then God must not be good with you. And so that means I'm not good with you. And so we feel justified in looking down on the people who don't try. And that's a hard form of religion, but it's the common way people understand God and faith. And what I would say to you is if you're here today and you've been living that way, maybe that's how it was presented to you and you complied. You went with it. And maybe you're tired. Maybe it's heavy. And maybe you have considered like giving up. I would encourage you to give that up. Because that's not the way that Jesus explained all of this, like all the things. That's not the form of Christianity that Jesus presented to the world. It's backwards. Or if you're here today and you're here because someone made you, or you're here because, okay, well, why not? What other options do I have? Or you're here today, but you really don't want to be. And for most of your life, you've been resisting church because that's the form of Christianity you didn't want to be part of. I would encourage you to continue resisting that form of religion, because that is not how Jesus explained God to the world. See, like, the good news is that no story starts in chapter 12. And while, like, there's a lot of abstraction in the first 11 chapters, those 11 chapters are the foundation on which chapter 12 and everything after it is built. And if you don't understand what's happening in those first chapters, you will end up with a backwards, upside down form of religion, Christianity, faith that is completely dependent on how well you're doing. You see, like, I can't go into detail with all the chapters, but the idea in chapters 1 through 11, where Paul starts out, is basically explaining the brokenness of the human race. Like, the search for something. A search for meaning, a search for purpose, like destructive ways of living. And you know this, right? Like, there's something about the human heart that is self-destructive. We do things we don't want to do. There are times we want to do things we know we shouldn't want to do, and we wish we didn't want to do, but we want to do them. There's part of the human condition that's just broken. And so we engage in this self-destructive behavior, all of us do, and it's cyclical. Hurting people hurt people. And Paul explains it's like the human race is stuck in this mess. And God, who could have just been like, oh, forget these people, or could have dropped the hammer, instead, like, walks into the mess. Motivated by what seems almost like irrational love, relentless love, like love that is completely independent of how well you're doing. We like call that grace. It's undeserved favor. Like, he just cares because he does. It's who he is. And what he explains is, like, to try to get people to understand how God is thinking. He's like, okay, think about this. How many people, Paul's explaining, it's like, how many people would give their lives up for a really good person? Like, pretty few, but maybe some. Like, okay, and even, like, in rare cases, people will give themselves for a righteous person, like a super good, perfect person. Rarely. But if you want to know what God's love looks like the perfect demonstration, he says in chapter 5, he's like, while we are like complete enemies, actively against God, actively, not passively, not sure, not doubting, but actively against him. In that state, that's when Jesus is like, I will give everything for you. And that's when he dies for us. He's like, I want you to picture yourself at your worst and know that's when he'll give everything. And he's like, that is the demonstration of love. And this whole idea of doing more right than wrong, like trying to hit this requirement, what Paul calls the righteous requirement of the law, like doing enough good to be good with God. He's like, when Jesus gave himself for you, he met that requirement. In other words, when you accept that reality, he's like, you're good. You're good with God. You're good with God. I remember the first time I heard someone explain it to me like that, like, oh, if you're worried about where you stand with God, like you accept what Jesus has done for you, you understand that, you're good. Like, you don't have to worry. And it's like all of a sudden there's this weight that's lifted. Because he's in your corner. Because you're good with God. And so then Paul comes to this place where he's like, if you think about someone who has given everything for you, he then like pivots to the practical side, right? And he says, so therefore, I urge you, I invite you. This is a word of encouragement. Like, listen, brothers and sisters. He's talking to people that he loves. He says, in view of God's mercy. I don't know if you're like me, you think mercy. I think of the game where you like take someone's hands, you twist them till they yell mercy. Everyone play that, or I just have a messed up childhood. This is the word. It's a word for like deep compassion, cheerful compassion. In view of that, he says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, in the ancient world, sacrifices were typically, it's like a distant concept for us, but sacrifices were typically given for one of two reasons: to cover guilt or to express gratitude. And so he's just explained, your guilt is covered. He's saying, live your life as an expression of gratitude, holy and pleasing to God. The word holy, it means like very simply different, set apart. Like live in a different way. And this is like pleasing to God. And then he says, this is your true and proper worship. The word for true and proper in the original language, it's the word logikos, which is where we get our English word logical. He's saying, this is the thing that makes sense to do when you see that there's a God who is like deeply, deeply concerned, who gave everything for you. You live not from a place of guilt, but from a place of gratitude. And so from there, we take all the things you have to do for God to be good with you, and maybe they become, follow me here, maybe all the things after that and after become all the things you're willing to do. Because God has been good to you. It's a response of gratitude, not obligation and guilt, because you're good with God. You're not working to earn his favor. You're given a spot in a family, a place in a family. Now, I don't know, but if you're like me, that works, gratitude, sometimes, right? Like the whole idea that God has done so much to me, for me, he's given so much to me, that works when it's convenient. You know, it's this whole idea, like he gave everything, Jesus died for me, I'll live for him, right? And yes, like if I've got 2 cookies and you've got 0, I will give you one for that reason, right? Because God has been good to me, let me like give something, and that's convenient. But you know what? Like, I don't know, if I'm being honest, that's not always enough. Like if there's something I really want, and I've got to decide whether to do the thing that God wants me to do or to go my own way. If I do the thing that God wants me to do, maybe I won't get that thing I really want. Then I don't know if gratitude is enough to really make me deprive myself of that thing. Right? Like, or if you've really hurt me, and like now I'm hearing Jesus say things about forgiveness, and that's tough, and there's like a real wound. I don't know, like the idea that God has been good to me, if that's enough to be like, okay, I will really inconvenience myself and do what I don't want to do simply as a way to say thanks to God. You see, this is nice. This is nice. It goes from being the right thing to do, right? To what this feels like is the nice thing to do. You know, if you're doing all the things, you're like willing to do them because God's been good to you. It's like returning the favor. All right, God did so much for me. I'll do the things he wants because I'm trying to do the nice thing. And then there's this whole concept, you ready? There's this whole concept of forgiveness. You know, because we're in a family now. And Paul explains, you're not a slave. You don't have to be like afraid. You're now in a family and you can look at God as your father. And so if you step out of line, you just ask for forgiveness and he's gonna forgive you. It's like, really? Like just over and over again? Yeah. All right. You know, there's a story about Jesus, like he died on the cross, if you know the story. Right next to him, there was this thief who was also on a cross, who was there because he deserved it. It's at the end of his life. He looks over at Jesus and he's like, remember me when you go into your kingdom. And Jesus is like, today you'll be with me in paradise. He goes to heaven. The guy lives his whole life doing whatever he wants. With 10 seconds left on the clock, he makes it in. And I'm like, okay, I wouldn't have said this out loud, but I'm like, that's my guy. I'm gonna do whatever I want. And as long as I have time to like shoot it up real quick, God's gonna forgive me. And that's true. God will forgive you for the things that you do. But Paul writing this letter, he actually, I guess like knowing the human race, he anticipates that question. He actually like throws out a bunch of rhetorical questions. At one point he says like, so should we continue to live like this? Continue to live in these destructive ways so that God can just keep forgiving us? He says, so that grace may abound. Like, and then he uses the most powerful negative there is in the ancient language. He's like, no way. And then he unpacks why. And for me, this was the difference maker. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It wasn't just about doing the nice thing. For me, this put everything in context. He has them go through this little like emotional, reflective exercise, and he asks them to reflect on the past. When they were doing things they know that they really shouldn't be doing. And here's what he says, right? And this for me is a powerful question. He goes, what benefit did you reap at that time from the things you are now ashamed of? He says, those things result in death. Now, in the ancient world, and you know this if you're familiar with some of the other writers of the New Testament, when they say things lead to death, obviously these people that he's writing to are still alive. What he's saying is that they lead to just heartbreak. They're crushing. It's toxic. It will destroy you. You will rot from the inside out. It's not something that you want. And so what he's saying here, he's like, just stop for a minute and think. When you went your own way, where did that lead? Right? Like maybe you wanted to get revenge and you knew like all the things, all the twos, like somewhere in there, you know, there's gotta be like a God says don't take revenge, but you're like, I just gotta get him back this one time. Right? Okay, fine. Maybe you did. And maybe in that moment it was like, I got him. But that relationship's done. Right? Or maybe you could go to that place or send that text or have that conversation that you know she wouldn't be okay with or he wouldn't be okay with, but you know like, okay, I don't think this is gonna ruin us, but maybe I could get away with it. And so you do it and you ask God for forgiveness and he does forgive you. But what has that done to your relationship? The relationship that you're living in. That's going to continue beyond that one circumstance. Or you knew in that situation it was convenient to like, I could just not tell the truth here. It would be so much easier if I don't. I'm just going to go around this, and God will forgive me, and he will. But what is that going to do to the way that other people who know that you lied see you? What is it going to do to the trust in that relationship when they need to know, okay, is this person a person of their word, or did they change it up when it's convenient for them? And Paul's saying like, just stop for a minute and think about that. And don't miss the big idea here. The big idea is the motive. The motive. Like some of us picture God and we picture this being up there that's just like, look at all these dummies that I can make listen to me and do these arbitrary things. Right? I say don't do that because I don't like him. And so they won't do that. And the people that do, I'll just like zap. Like we picture God as this angry being that's just throwing things out there. But what Paul's arguing is that these things come back to hurt you. There's someone looking out for you. And he comes to this point in chapter 8 where he steps back, he asks this question. This is one of my favorite verses in the whole thing. He says, so what then shall we say in response to all this? Everything I've just said. How do you respond to this? He says, if God is for us, who can be against us? The idea here is that you are his motive. If you're wondering who says and why, the answer is God says for your good. In other words, like, these are not all the things, the to-dos and to-don'ts. They're not all the things you have to do so God will be good with you. They're not even all the things maybe you'll be willing to do because God has been good to you. What I would suggest is what God wants us to see and feel is that these are all the things maybe that you will come to want to do when you see that God wants good for you. In other words, maybe when you're faced with a situation and you got to go right or left and you want to go left, but you know probably God wants you to go right. Rather than feeling like, okay, this is the right thing to do, rather than feeling like, okay, this is the nice thing to do to respond in gratitude for everything God's given me, what if you feel like, okay, I may not see it, but in this situation for you, like, this is the best thing for you. That's the place that God wants us to land. When we come to a place, a crossroads, and we're not sure which way to go. We want to go one way, he wants us to go another, and we stop and trust, not fear his punishment, but trust he wants good for me. That's how Jesus wants us to see all the things, because there's a lot of them. There's a lot of to-dos and to-don'ts. It's not what the relationship is built on. It's a product of the relationship because he's concerned for you. And so at one point, Jesus actually says to an entire crowd, he gives this big, long sermon. At the end, he's like, look, those of you who listen to what I say, who hear it and put it into practice, it's like you take your house and you build it on a rock. And those of you who don't, it's like you build your house on the sand. Now, the point of that story is not that Jesus is a rock. The point is that it's smart to build a house on a rock, and it's dumb to build a house in the sand. He's saying, like, I'm looking out for you. The question, if you hear all the do's and don'ts, it's not about where you stand with God. If you're asking who, the answer is God. If you're asking why, what's the motive? You are that motive. You're good. He's deeply invested in your good. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here. But really what this all comes down to, like when you think religion, my hope for you, when you think Jesus, when you think Christianity, church, whatever you want to call it, it's not following rules. It's following a person, Jesus, who is deeply invested in your good to the point that he would give everything for you. And so the question I would love for you to wrestle with this next week, like really, not intellectually, what do you know, but when you think about God, do you feel like he's for you or against you? Is he the hero or the villain? Because how you answer that question, how that lands with you really will change the way you interpret the reality that you live in. If I could leave you with this metaphor, right? It's ridiculous, but think about this, okay? Imagine, and here's what I mean. Imagine you've got a shed in your backyard, okay? And behind the shed, there's poison ivy. If God is against you, if he's the villain in your story, and he says, don't go behind the shed, it doesn't matter what you do, he's gonna come out the villain, right? Because if you choose not to go behind the shed, well, then he's holding back from you. He's just trying to steal your fun. But if you do go behind the shed, you're gonna come out with poison ivy, and you're gonna feel like he's punishing you. But if God is the hero of your story, and where he wants to bring us is to the point where we hear him say, don't go behind the shed, and we feel like if he doesn't want me behind the shed, I don't want to be behind the shed. Because I trust that he wants my good. In fact, if you want to exhaust the metaphor, what Paul's explaining is that it's like each one of us has gone behind the shed. has gotten covered in poison ivy, and God goes running into the poison ivy to pull us out, only to nurse our wounds afterwards. He's the hero of the story, and he wants you to see that he's for you, not against you.